So we're moving along. We're on to chapter 14. We're going to talk about the courts. A couple of interesting pieces here. This chapter is an entire branch of government, and they only put it into one chapter. So it's difficult to get everything in. It's difficult to talk about all of the court system in one chapter. And so your book goes over things very briefly, very superficially. If there is a question or an issue that you notice in the book that you feel like you want more information on, I would certainly encourage you to do your own research because the book doesn't do a great job at getting into the very clear specifics, and that may or may not come up in the test. I have no idea. Okay, so judicial review is a term that you should know. It's right away in the beginning of the chapter. And this is the power of the Supreme Court or of any court to hold a law or other legal action as unconstitutional. And essentially that's what the court system is based on, is this idea that we pass laws, we execute those laws. This is the branch that gets to interpret whether it is considered constitutional, if it fits into our American governmental society or not. So we have a couple of sources of American law. Where do we pull law from? Where do courts get these ideas of what is constitutional or what is not, what is fair and what is not? The first is what we call common law. This is really the most common piece of law that we use. And what we call in sort of the everyday term is this is judge-made law. This is law that judges have put together based on rulings and sentencing of other cases. It originated in England from decisions shaped according to prevailing custom. Decisions were applied to similar situations, and gradually they became common to the nation. So, I haven't told you this yet. I just got an email that we're going to go in May to the Dane County Courthouse and meet with a Dane County judge. We're also going to talk to the woman who runs jury duty. She's going to tell you what happens when she calls people to jury duty, and you'll get to go sit in the courtroom and see everything and all that. So when we go, sometimes you get invited back to the judge's chambers, essentially his office. And what you'll notice is on his office or out of his clerk's office are books and books and books on the walls, and they all look the same. What that is that's basically the collection of common law. Anytime a judge makes a determination, a sentence, or a ruling based on a specific case, that all gets published every single year. And so if I am a judge and a case is brought to me in a specific set of situations and I'm trying to figure out how I should rule, I'm going to turn to those books. I'm going to turn to common law to sort of get a sense of what have other people been doing so that we stay consistent in the judicial branch. We want to make sure that when we have law, it is as consistent as possible no matter where you are or who you see. Precedent, which is this is what we would call that ruling ahead of time where a judge relies on those precedents. Constitutions would be the next source. We have one, the Constitution of the federal government, but also we have constitutions of the state government. And these set forth basic organizations, powers, and limits of government. And so we do turn to the Constitution often when we're trying to figure out if someone has overstepped their boundaries as far as the rights that they've been given by our general government. Statutes and administrative regulations, these are sort of everyday rules and regulations that you have to live by. Statutes are laws enacted by legislatures. They've been more important in defining your rights and obligations to individuals. Federal statutes may regulate any subject that is the concern of the federal government. It may apply to areas ranging from hazardous waste to federal taxation. These are sort of the everyday things that our legislative branches, state or federal, pass on a day-to-day basis. And they really can be things as how high can your grass be before you have to cut it or you'll receive a fine, to how much money do you need to pay back to the federal government every year when you make over a certain bracket of money. And then the last source of American law that we pull from is what we call case law. And this is judicial interpretations of common law principles, as well as interpretations of constitutional law. So basically what we consider case law is what are those interpretations, and so we use them over and over and over again. So I'll give you an example. A piece of case law that we may use is an interpretation of what the Supreme Court ruled last June in regards to same-sex marriages. And essentially what their ruling was not actually in favor or against same-sex marriage. It was the idea that in legal terms, a couple that is of the same sex should have the same legal rights as any other couple that is married in a court of law. Which essentially means that when you go to insurance, when you talk about adoption, when you talk about healthcare rights, wills, estates, all of those things, those should be granted to a couple that has been married no matter what their gender or sexuality is. That's case law, right? So they used common law to sort of get that idea. Now we use it as case law to sort of use that interpretation over and over and over again. So when the judge in Kentucky decided not to grant marriage licenses, they're using case law to say, hey, that's an interpretation that a court has already decided. You have to sort of follow case law. You have to follow what has already been interpreted beforehand. And we kind of also use that as judicial review. Again, the idea that the Supreme Court gets to decide what's constitutional. And other courts get to decide what is appropriate or not. Okay, so the federal court system. Now, unfortunately, your book isn't going to go through like the steps of the court system, like the trial court, Court of Appeals, the Supreme Court. They talk about all of those things, but they don't give a very clear, like, basic understanding of that. If that's something that you're still super unclear about, or it feels a little rusty to you since you took American government, or if you didn't take American government, I would highly advise that you go back to my website and take a look at those American government slides. It's important that you understand just the basic structure. What court do you go to first? What court do you go to if you don't like the ruling? Can you go to the Supreme Court for certain things? Can you not go to the Supreme Court for certain things? What are some of those judicial basic legal rights, ex post facto law, habeas corpus, due process? All of those terms aren't necessarily highlighted in this chapter, so make sure that you've got a good background piece as far as those things go. Okay, so for the federal court system, we need to talk a little bit about jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is the authority of a court to decide certain cases. Not all courts have the authority to decide all cases. And really what we talk about here is, what's the jurisdiction? When I commit a crime, what jurisdiction am I going into? What jurisdiction do I fit into? Did I commit a federal crime? Did I commit a state crime? Did I cross state lines when I committed this crime? They're going to try and figure out which court of jurisdiction I go to. So there are a couple of things here. What they're talking about, federal question or diversity of citizenship, those are pretty quintessential pieces that would send you into the federal court system's jurisdiction. Diversity of citizenship is the condition that exists when parties to a lawsuit are citizens of different states. So if you're unsure what that means, it's just the idea of, is it a dispute between states? If it's a dispute between states in any way, shape, or form, it's going to go to the federal court system, right? We're not going to try and decide which state court gets to hear that crime. The minute you cross the state line, the minute I sue somebody in another state, or I go ahead and, fraud someone in another state, I'm going to go to a federal court. Okay, so dual structure of the American court system. Hopefully this kind of brings you back to American government a little bit. U.S. district courts on the left-hand side, this is what we call the bottom level of the federal court system. It's also called the trial court. So if I commit a federal crime, if I cross state lines, if I sue somebody or defraud somebody across state lines, I'm going to go to U.S. District Court. Usually it's in specific states. Wisconsin has 2 federal courts, essentially. If I don't like that ruling, I can go to the U.S. Court of Appeals. And if I don't like that ruling and there's a constitutional question here, I could go to the Supreme Court, okay? On the other side, if I break a state crime or I break state law, I'm going to go to the state trial court. That's the entry level of the state system. If I don't like that case or outcome, I'm going to go to the appellate court, the state appellate court. If I don't like that outcome, I'll go to the highest state courts. Now notice that that doesn't say the state Supreme Court. If I go to the state Supreme Court, I'm not going to the U.S. Supreme Court. The only time a U.S. Supreme Court is going to take a case like that is if multiple state Supreme Courts are hearing basically the same case. So I'll go to the highest state court. If I don't like that, then there's a chance I can go to the U.S. Supreme Court if there's an issue that has sort of a constitutional piece, especially in the federal constitution. If I have a problem with Wisconsin state constitution, I would never end up in the U.S. Supreme Court. I would simply end up in the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Okay, so types of federal courts. U.S. District Court, that is the trial court. It's essentially the first entry level of where you go if you commit a federal crime. Again, if I don't like that, I'm going to go to the U.S. Court of Appeals, and if that case, if the Court of Appeals sort of decides, hey, maybe someone else should review this again, or they decide and I still want to appeal it, I can go on to the Supreme Court. Normally, the U.S. Court of Appeals is sort of the middleman, and they don't have a ton of power in the sense that even their ruling can be sent up to the Supreme Court. However, right now, as we speak, the U.S. Court of Appeals is one of the most powerful courts in our country, and that's because our Supreme Court doesn't have a full bench of justices. And so what that means is that until our Supreme Court has a full bench of justices, all of the Court of Appeals rulings are final. It means that that's kind of where everything sits right now. The Supreme Court isn't really going to take a lot of cases. The cases that they do take, if they deadlock 4-4, right, because they're at 8 justices right now, which in most cases they will, because we've got 4 very conservative interpreting justices and 4 sort of liberal-leaning interpretive justices. So we would often see a deadlock. If that happens, the ruling automatically goes down to the Court of Appeals. So the Court of Appeals is actually very powerful right at this moment. Typically, they are sort of the middleman. Lots of people don't see them as being super powerful in the sense that there's always a step ahead of them. But right now, there really isn't a step ahead of them. A couple of other things, bankruptcy courts, federal regulatory agencies, territorial courts, tax courts. We're going to go through a couple of specific pieces of courts that we have that maybe you don't know about that are just as important. One of them is the FISA court. I don't think it's on here. Oh, okay. I'm going to keep going through here really quickly. This is the district court circuit, basically. So we're in the 7th Circuit. You'll notice, you can't really see it, but Wisconsin is divided basically straight down the middle. We have a western half district court and an eastern half district court. That's where you would decide to go. But it's based on population. So you notice like states like Montana, there's only 1 court for the whole state. Wyoming is the same way. And they're divided into districts. Essentially, this is where their process is. So we have 2 district courts. Our appeals court in our district is actually in Chicago. So when those rulings are appealed, then that's where that next court goes. And so that's how they decide where you're going to go if you go to the Court of Appeals. I'm trying to see, like there are little marks where everything is. Okay, so there are some special federal courts that we need to talk about, especially when we talk about the war on terrorism, because there have been a few federal courts that have been designed to specifically target this area. Now, the FISA court, I'm hoping that this rings a little bell to you because the documentary that we watched earlier this year talked a lot about the FISA court. The FISA court is a court that was put together. It stands for Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. That's how it was designed. There are 7 judges. They meet in secret. There's no published opinions. And essentially their job is to authorize surveillance on specific Americans or people who hold visas in our country. So when there's a threat, when a security agency like the CIA or the FBI notices something fishy going on, they may appeal to the FISA court to get more rights to surveil, is that the word I'm looking for? To monitor you, essentially. If you'll remember when we watched the Frontline documentary, the FISA court at one point basically drew up an entire blanket ruling to allow the NSA to monitor anybody that they felt was a threat. They sort of handed over basically all of their power to the NSA at one point to say, hey, you've got a person you're worried about, you just assume we're gonna write it off, we'll pass it, don't worry about it. The other specialized court that we see is the Alien Removal Court. This is a court that hears evidence against suspected alien terrorists. So make sure that you understand that this isn't just like an immigration court. We've got plenty of those. This is one that's very specific to terrorist activity. If we feel like someone who is in our country on a visa, a green card, maybe not even real proper documentation, but has been participating in some activities that may be questionable, they can be called to the Alien Removal Court. Judges rule if there's probable cause for deportation. And again, you don't hear a lot about it because typically they do their job better when the media isn't right there. Parties to lawsuits. So, litigate is a term that you need to know. This is to engage in legal proceedings or to seek relief in the court of law. Basically, to carry out a lawsuit. If you're carrying out a lawsuit, you're litigating, or you're hiring someone to litigate for you. What we often see in the federal system is what we call a class action suit. This is a lawsuit filed by an individual seeking damages for all persons similarly situated. So essentially, you're representing a group of people and the issues that apply to that group of people. So we often see class action lawsuits from a specific group of people, but they also represent a larger group of people. Procedural rules here. A party who commits civil contempt can be taken into custody, fined, or both until the party complies with the court's order. This is a big one. Why? Because of Apple. Right now, there is a lot of questions going on in the federal court system because Apple has been basically directed by a federal court to unlock Saeed Farouk's phone, and they're not doing it, and so they're up for potential large fines or potential custody. That some people in Apple could be called into, basically be arrested. I don't think it'll be that because there are a couple of other exceptions here, but it could become a pretty big issue. A party who commits criminal contempt can also be taken into custody, but can't avoid punishment by complying with a previous order. So essentially, if you've committed a criminal order or a criminal act and you choose not to comply with what the court's asked you to do, you can be charged for that as well. They don't just forgive it if you go ahead and do what they've asked you to do. They can actually then charge you again for what you didn't do that the court said you needed to do. Big in the news in the last few days, Guantanamo, we call it Gitmo in the executive branch. The president has officially decided to close Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay is considered a part of the federal court system. There is a federal court there. They hear cases right in Guantanamo Bay. But the idea here is that the setting is not as up to the standard of what United States federal court systems typically are, and in general, it's got a pretty bad rap. I will tell you that I do know a woman who was a guard at Guantanamo Bay. I'm trying to get her to come in and talk to you guys because she has a fascinating story. She worked, well, she still is in the military, and she was stationed right away. It was her first deployment to Guantanamo Bay to be a guard, and she was in charge of 7 really high-level terrorists. She almost lost one day. And she'll tell you a little bit about the environment and the attitude of it. It was really kind of an eye-opening experience for her to really see what it really looks like. We'll see. I'm hoping she'll come. So which cases reached the Supreme Court? This is probably one of the biggest questions that I get, especially in American government. A couple of pieces of background here really quickly. The Supreme Court begins its annual term on the first Monday of October. Notice that October is sort of a big month in the federal government. The budget gets started, things like that. So the Supreme Court starts in October, and they usually adjourn around late June, early July of the next year. So they have a pretty long summer break, I guess you could call it. Right now they are hearing cases, however, obviously things have really slowed down since Scalia's death. And you'll notice that lots of rulings get published in June and July. That's because they're done with their term. What typically happens is on the biggest cases that the Supreme Court hears in any term, they'll wait until the end of the term to release the findings or to release the opinion of that court. Part of it is just timing. Part of it is that then they're out of session, and so they don't have to really continue to hear things, and so everyone can sort of go crazy and speculate and things like that. So you'll notice, like last year, the Affordable Care Act decision was published in June. The same-sex marriage decision was published in June. They're typically big times of the year for that. Okay, so what causes a case to go to the Supreme Court? First, the court can choose the cases it wants to decide. They receive over 10,000 case requests a year. They choose less than 100 of those cases to actually hear. And the court gets to decide that. And when I say the court, I mean all justices get to decide which cases they hear. Essentially what will happen is their staffs will take out, some of the big ones that they think are really important. The justices will read them over. They will meet and they will vote. And if it has a majority vote, they'll take the case. And if it doesn't have the majority vote, they will not take the case. So if you know anything about the Supreme Court has actually been asked to take the same-sex marriage ruling for years and years and years. They just didn't. They didn't want to go ahead and make that determination until last year. They decided to go ahead and take a case that dealt with it. The justices never have to explain their reasons for taking a case or for not taking a case. So we don't often know why the Supreme Court will take a certain case or not. But there are a couple of factors that will sort of move a case in. If there's a legal question that's been decided differently by various lower courts. So if one court has decided yes and one court has decided no, and this state has decided yes and that state has decided no, that's going to push the Supreme Court to really make a determination. And essentially that's why they took the case of same-sex marriage, because some states were granting equal rights as far as a legal basis, and some states weren't. And that was becoming a problem. The Supreme Court's job is to sort of keep continuity in the judicial branch, and so that will often pull them in. One other thing is when a lower court's decision conflicts with an existing Supreme Court ruling, they'll take that case. So if a lower court decided to do something that is technically against the Supreme Court, but they have grounds for that, they'll often hear that case to sort of clear up some of those things. Remember that when Supreme Courts make decisions, they don't think of every exception, and so sometimes those exceptions do come out, and so then the Supreme Court will take it just to sort of settle that. And the last piece is whether the issue could have significance beyond the parties of the dispute. So whether it could have real significance to a large group of people. One of them would be the case that the Supreme Court took last year that kind of got overshadowed by all the other big ones, was a case against Abercrombie and Fitch for refusing to hire a woman who was wearing a headdress for her religion. She was Muslim, and they had a dress code that said you couldn't wear like hats, and so they refused to hire her. She took it all the way to the Supreme Court. The reason the Supreme Court would take a case like that is not because they're interested in Abercrombie and Fitch and other retail stores. It's because they're interested in the Muslim faith and what that would mean for hundreds of millions of other Muslims in the world, or especially in this country, who are trying to get jobs. And so it does have a much bigger impact beyond just that one person. The right of certiorari is the idea that it's an order issued by a higher court to a lower court to send the record for a case for review. So this is how the Supreme Court's going to get a better sense of what they're going to look at. It's required by law that all courts have to send, all of their information. And like I said before, we have what we call the Rule of Four, and this is the United States Supreme Court's procedure, which 4 justices must vote to grant a petition for review if a case has come before the full court. So this is the idea that if you have 4 justices who vote, hey, we need to go and review this a little bit more, then they go ahead and do that. Lots of people have this misconception that the Chief Justice gets that job. No, the Chief Justice really doesn't have a whole lot of power. He just sort of runs the Supreme Court, but he doesn't get a lot of power in deciding cases or choosing cases. And then deciding cases. Each justice is entitled to 4 law clerks. Keep your eyes peeled for those law clerks because they often become Supreme Court justices. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a law clerk. Sonia Sotomayor, I believe, is a law clerk for a federal court justice. Most of them are law clerks at some point in their career at some point. Oral arguments. So this is where they'll stand before each of the justices. Okay, I'll finish this tomorrow.
The air conditioning.
Yeah. U.S. versus Nixon is due tomorrow.